What's up, you guys? Today I want to talk a little bit about the GHD. So this is something that we don't use super often, and it's one of the few machines that we usually use, but it can be a super benefit to you. So one of the great things about this is not only does it work your core, and so anything in your trunk, but it's also going to work your posterior chain, so anything on the backside, your hamstrings and glutes, right? But it also is going to bring kinesthetic awareness of where my body is, especially in my hips and my trunk, where we need to use it for deadlifting, squatting, or just like picking things up. So number one is we're going to start with the hip extension. And when we do the hip extension, what we want to do is keep the hip, or the hip is going to be dynamic and the trunk is going to be static. So just like when we move for picking something up. When we move, I want you to move from your hips, so where your femur goes into your pelvis. And this is the part that is going to move. So I set this up so that my hip crease is going to be off the pad. So it's completely off the pad so that it can move. I'm going to come down. Now notice keeping the trunk static and the hip is dynamic. All right. Then we can go into the back extension. The back extension is going to be the opposite. The hip is going to be static and the trunk is going to be dynamic. Now this is something you don't want to do in a high intensity fashion, so you're not going to use a lot of speed because you're intentionally surrendering control of your back. So what I'm going to do is hip is extended and locked, and I'm going to tuck and I'm going to roll each vertebrae until I get to the bottom, and then come back up from the bottom and extend through the top. So one more time, tucking down through each vertebrae and then back up. Now we can put them both together. So now we're going to do a hip and back extension. And so we can start out with our hip static and our trunk is dynamic, and then I'm going to loosen the hip, and then I come back up, tighten the hip, and then come back up. So again, tucking in, then letting loose of the hip, and then back up, and rolling back up. So working each vertebrae from the hip to through the neck. Then the last thing, and this is where most people see people use the GHD, is the GHD sit-up. Now we're going to switch to the opposite side. We still want our hip to be all the way off of the mat so that it can move. So I'm going to get my feet in. I'm going to come back with knees bent, and then legs extend to come up. So now this is not going to be a curl or a crunch. So I'm not just wrenching myself up. My trunk is going to be static again, and so a lot of the work that I'm doing here is static holding, almost like a plank. And then I'm going to extend with my legs to bring my hip up. So my legs extend, and I come back up. My legs are shooting forward, almost reaching towards the plate, and that's gonna flex my hip. Now, if you've gotten good at these, you can start getting more range of motion, and you can eventually be going to full extension and then flexing in. So 4 ways that you can use this. You've got the hip extension, you've got the back extension, the hip and back extension, and then we've got the GHD sit-up. Not only is this going to strengthen your core and your posterior chain, but it's going to help you move better and more confidently when you're doing things like deadlifts and squats.